And now it's like Donald Trump is he's walking into this trap. There certainly has been some positives of the Trump administration so far, but man, is he flirting with throwing all of that away.
So Dave Smith recently had a podcast where he talked about Trump's decision to bomb Yemen, apparently escalating that war. A lot of people don't know about it, really. It's not really in the public eye, especially compared to, say, Israel and Ukraine. But the U.S. has been involved in a decade-spanning proxy war in Yemen. And Trump decided to bomb certain targets in Yemen, and Dave thinks that that's a trap that Trump is walking into. So I wanted to hear him react to this, and I wanted to react to him reacting to this. So let's give it a watch.
Let's open with talking about kind of what's going on in Yemen and Donald Trump's recent threats to Iran. I guess I would start by saying this, okay? If you look at the position that Donald Trump is in right now, and I'm not trying to overplay it, look, like Donald Trump has put up his best approval numbers that he's had in both of his terms in pretty consistently in polling in the last few weeks since he's been president for the second time. But it's we're still talking about just above 50%. I think 53, 54% is about the highest that he's had. So still, it's not a president with 75% approval ratings, which, I actually have lived through a couple of. I don't know if in the current divided landscape in America, any president is going to get to be above 70% anytime soon. But
maybe George Bush Sr. and Reagan had that at some extent.
Donald Trump is doing better than he was before. I'm not trying to overplay it, but he's roughly popular with the American voting base. Really more of the unique opportunity in the moment that Donald Trump's in is how destroyed the Democrats are. I mean, the approval ratings of the Democrats are in the toilet. They've also, what I think is the most devastating aspect is that they've lost their propaganda apparatus, and the corporate media is just dead. And dead in a way, I mean, we may have said that years ago, but they're dead in a different type of way than they were back then. In this moment, you have a lot of possibilities. Donald Trump seems to, although he may himself only be slightly popular, he has a few issues that are enormously popular, where he's really got a mandate. Things like lowering inflation, lowering illegal immigration, turning the economy around. I mean, these are issues that he really has a lot of support behind his prescribed policies. And now he's got a thing that he never had in his first term, which is that he got this kind of class of big tech billionaires who are totally behind him. He really just never had anything like that before. If you could think about Donald Trump's first administration, Twitter was like his enemy. Now he's got the guy who owns Twitter in the White House.
That is an interesting dynamic. If you would have told me in, say 2019 that in Trump's discontinuous second term, a fair swath of big tech would be behind him, I would have thought you were crazy.
If you were to ask yourself, as many people do, what could possibly bring this down? What could possibly lead to the Democrats making a comeback? What could lose Donald Trump all of these gains that he's made so far? The answer is so obviously another catastrophic war. Just getting into another war that we absolutely don't need to be in. And yet, despite this reality, Donald Trump and whoever the hell is in his administration who he's listening to seem to be getting him to push in that direction. And then it is something, it just makes you want to pull your hair out watching it. The idea that we would even start, and I'm not saying he's done that yet. Donald Trump is capable of doing these strikes here and there, just killing some people so we can all feel better or something like that with really no strategic point. Do you think about his bombing campaigns in Syria in his first term? But to attack Yemen and then to start using this provocative language toward Iran, making more threats toward them, it just seems like there is no positive that comes out of it. Again, other than maybe he gets to say, I'm the big tough guy who murdered some people.
And talk about a threat of a war. I can't remember another time in my life, maybe outside of the Arab Spring of what was that, 2009, where the threat of a regional war in the Middle East seems like a definitive possibility. You have, Israel and their war path of bloodshed in Gaza, the potential of Israel becoming Greater Israel and occupying parts of Syria, the turnaround in the government of Syria that just happened there, the Yemeni civil war that we're talking about now. Like, there seems to be these alliance structures that could, explode. And for Trump to, put his nose into that and be willing to get involved in that just seems crazy to me. It seems so counterintuitive, even by Trump's agenda.
And the downside is just an endless pit of catastrophe that could ruin everything, every positive that he's already been able to implement. So I guess that's just like the first point I would make on this recent insane move to attack Yemen. Any thoughts you want to jump in with? Go ahead, Rob.
I think that that's all fair. And what I would take the biggest issue with is just when we're out in the world and we're murdering innocent terrorists.
No, sorry. Did you? I don't know if that was me or you, but you cut out there for a second. Could you just say that line again? We're out in the world is where I lost you.
Yeah, when we're out in the world and we're murdering innocent civilians, I don't really see the distinction between us and terrorists.
Yeah, well, I mean, the distinction seems to be like, well, do you have a military?
There's no more greater and more dangerous terrorist force than the modern U.S. war machine. That's for sure.
All right, if you have a military, then it's not terrorism. Or like if you're an ally of America, then it's not terrorism, Yeah, there's just to give like a little bit of like a quick background on this stuff, because it's a little interesting that, as you know well, Rob, because you've been with me for years at this point, the Yemen was an issue that really our camp was amongst the only groups caring about or talking about this for many years. It was from the end of the Obama administration through the entire Trump administration into the beginning of the Joe Biden administration. And in fact, when the Mises Caucus took over the Libertarian Party, this was like the first big initiative that we launched, was this like calling your congressman campaign to get an end to the war in Yemen.
I'm proud to have helped Dave with that when I helped run the National Libertarian Party Twitter. Me and Dave worked on that and kind of a messaging campaign to get people to call their congressman. I really wish it would have worked, that, we would have gotten out of that theater. It seemed like Biden was entertaining it for a while too, but he got talked out of that too by the top brass of, guess who? Probably the Israeli lobby and the military industrial complex.
And it wasn't really until after October 7th. By the way, I shouldn't say it's not just the anti-war libertarians. There were like some small groups of good anti-war leftists, or like the Code Pink and the Quakers for Peace and people like that, who talked a lot about the just humanitarian nightmare that was in Ukraine for many years. But anyway, it wasn't really until after October 7th when the Houthis started kind of fighting back and sticking up for the Palestinians, that the world started talking a lot about the Houthis in Yemen and how horrible they are, and oh my God, they're attacking American cargo ships or whatever. But just so people know, this really goes back to the beginning of the Obama administration. And in 2009, when Obama first became president, he launched like a CIA drone war in Yemen. And it was pretty much, it was essentially, I think, one of the only theaters in the war on terrorism where the actual goal seemed to be a war on terrorism. Like at this point in Afghanistan, we were fighting against the Taliban and working on a regime change war there. We had already driven Al Qaeda out. Like we weren't like fighting Al Qaeda really much anymore in Afghanistan. And while there may have been some Al Qaeda guys in the insurgency in Iraq, we were really there, fighting to prop up the Shiite democracy that we had installed. And
democracy in quotes for sure.
In Libya, which I guess came a year later or 2 years later, we were there to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. Had absolutely nothing to do with the war on terrorism, and in fact, we were on the side of the Bin Ladenites when we were doing that. In Syria, we were on the side of the Bin Ladenites when we were trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. But in Yemen, at least in 2009, and really, I think up until around 2015. That was the mission. We were drone bombing AQIP in Syria. Now, throughout that time, and it's pretty well documented, Al Qaeda, AQIP being Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they grew in number, and for the same typical reasons that this always happens. It's General McChrystal's insurgent math, right? This was his famous term, 10 minus 2 equals 20. You have some targeted strike, which is, we like to think of them as like these targeted strikes. But, when you're on the ground, these are strikes that end up killing. I think there was, at one point, there had been a major study on Obama's drone war specifically, where the number they came out with was 96% of the people killed in the strikes were innocent people. And when you say innocent people, meaning they weren't the target of the person who was on the list. Sometimes also the person on the list was wrong, because it's not like, oh, you've had a fair trial for all these people and you figured out who are the terrorists and who are not the terrorists. But even by their own list, just assuming everyone on the list is guilty, if you want to, something like 95, 96% of the people killed weren't that. And so every time you'd have one of these strikes, you kill 3 little girls, and then all of their brothers and uncles and fathers and all of these guys join up with Al Qaeda, because now they are, radicalized to want to fight against America. So it's a completely counterproductive and evil, fucked up, drone bombing campaign for most of Obama's presidency. Now, just to keep in mind here, Yemen at that point already was the poorest country in the Middle East. They're just murdering innocent people in the poorest country in a poor area. It's just, whatever. Not to offend my my debate competitor Josh Hammer, but you do tend to get caught up in the morality of that a little bit. Like, Jesus, just murdering poor people in the poorest country in the Middle East sounds pretty fucked up. But where it really got was after that, and essentially, like. The Obama administration was propping up the dictator in Yemen at the time and using him for all types of like secret torture and shit like that. And eventually, then he, even though he was a Shiite, he was at odds with the Houthis at one point, and then later on they ended up like joining up and kind of being on the same side when the Saudis and the Americans tried to get his second in command to take over for him, and the Houthis ended up gaining more and more strength. And they started taking over more and more territory in the area. And the Saudis did not like this at all. The Saudis are enemies with the Houthis, and the Saudis were really upset at America. And they were upset at America at this point. We're getting into like late 2014, early 2015. They were upset at the Americans because, number one, they were furious about the war in Iraq still. If you remember, the Saudis were really our allies in the region who opposed the war in Iraq the whole time. But, the neocons wanted it and Israel wanted it. And so they won out.
It's worth noting, too, that Saudi Arabia's government played a role in the 9/11 attacks, and that was revealed in redacted pages at the end of the original 9/11 Commission report, where the government wouldn't even allow those pages to be exposed to the American masses, and we found that out later. These are America's allies. The House of Saud, Saudi Arabia.
They got this regime change. The Saudis were furious because, of course, the Saudis, who are our Sunni sock puppet state in the region, their big enemy is Iran. the Shiites. And so they didn't care much for the idea that we would take out Saddam Hussein and then hand this majority Shiite country their influence over to Iran. Like this hurt them in the region. So they were very upset about it. And then Obama turned around and made the deal with Iran. And so they were and again, you can Google these words, and several really good articles will come up if you just Google Obama placate the Saudis, because this is what Obama officials said was the reason that Barack Obama backed the Saudi invasion in 2015. Now, just to be clear, if you Google that, the articles that are going to pop up, I'm not sending you to like read Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com or to read Scott Horton or to read Ron Paul. I'm saying like there's articles from the Council on Foreign Relations, the New York Times, Reuters, the Associated Press, like all of this placate the Saudis. This was the official justification for why Barack Obama launched what turned into a war of genocide, because we had to placate the Saudis, like the worst violators of human rights in the region.
I don't know if Dave's going to get into this, but when it's all said and done, this proxy war catastrophe in Yemen may cost 1 million lives. I've seen various projections of the number of people that have died in this. Most of them are innocents that can't get access to food and medicine, dying of cholera in mass numbers because of it. But a lot of them say around 500,000. It's hard to really know, but a lot of it is starving poor people in, as Dave said, the poorest country in the region. I think Yemen's actually the poorest country in the world. So it's just such a sad proxy war that the U.S. is involved with just to bail out the Saudis in a fight that isn't ours. The Yemeni Houthis have no, chance of threatening an American whatsoever.
Which is really saying something. We had to placate them because, like, sorry, we did that other war you didn't like, and then we made a nuclear inspections deal that you didn't like. So we'll help you launch a war against the poorest country in the Middle East for no reason, for no discernible reason that helps Americans. And just to be clear, I mean, what the Saudis did in Yemen was every bit as brutal, if not more, than what Israel's doing in Gaza right now. I mean, maybe there's a smarter person than me who's really done like some academic papers on this to sit down. But I mean, it was every bit. I think it was even worse because, like, I think the total number of people who died was even worse. And I think just the fact that it was Saudi Arabia conducting the war, just there just wasn't the type of pressure on them that there is on a first world country to be like, yeah, you can't get away with that. Like even Israel, has to slow down on shooting the aid workers after a few weeks of bad press. But the Saudis, again, with the help of the U.S. Army, I mean, for years we were like refueling their fighter jets mid-path because they can't do it themselves. And they had help from our Navy to put a full blockade around the country. And people died by the hundreds of thousands in the most brutal way. And the Saudis were also caught several times, like barming farms, barming sewage plants, barming irrigation sites, but just a war on the civilian population. And so in this whole thing, I mean, I know you read a bit about this during the time, Rob, because we talk about this all the time. There were outbreaks of cholera where there just hundreds of thousands of people got them. And of course, cholera particularly ends up killing babies and old people and can be cured with liquids. I'm not sure. I don't even think you need antibiotics. I think you need like Gatorade or whatever. But
they still die because the supplies don't go in. That's the horrors of war and the sanction regime and the embargo regime and the blockade regime. And that's the U.S.'s primary role in this. It's naval ships that are part of this blockade against innocent people that have no, fight in this. They have no place in terms of, being an adversarial party to the U.S. They're just innocents dying over this chessboard between, two factions that want to control more of Yemen.
There's just babies like vomiting themselves to death. It was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world for many years. I think at least from like 2015 through 2021, it was the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And through all of this, the Houthis remained in power. And I think they even just took over more control of the country. And they simply outlasted the Saudis and won. And they'd be able to hit back a little bit. Like they had like some drones that could strike some oil, sites in Saudi Arabia. And eventually, like the Saudis just tired of it. And they were like, we can't beat them. And they threw in the towel. And it was early in the Biden administration that the Saudis just kind of quit doing it. And so just to keep in mind here, and part of the reason why I say this is like, I think it's almost everybody talking about the story today, like kind of leaves out all that. It's just like you're supposed to, in the same sense that like October 7th is supposed to be viewed in a vacuum. Like here was the nice little Jewish boys just in there. We were just trying to have a rave outside your concentration camp, and then out of nowhere this happened. But like, no, there's actually a history and these things happen in context.
This is so true, and this is the biggest thing about the war regime and the neocons. They always pretend and propagandize as if history started yesterday, as if there was no justification or lead up to any of these atrocities. Again, not to justify it. Same thing happened with 9/11. Well, 9/11 was clearly caused not for our freedom, but because of bellicose U.S. foreign policy. And bin Laden said that explicitly in his letters. He said that it was because of U.S. support for Iraq, basically the militarization and occupation of the Holy Lands. That apparently brought tears to his eyes when that happened. So like there was real reasons for it. Doesn't justify any of the atrocities, but the neocons always pretend like the last thing is the first thing, because that's the only way they can justify all this regime change and military strikes.
And okay, so all of that happened, but I also say it not just to understand that there's the history of all of this, but I say it just to make the point that like the Houthis went through all of that and are still in control and are still trying to fight back. Now, many people, myself included, might say, Jesus, why the hell are you guys doing this? Like, haven't your people been through enough that you're going to bring more of this on them? But that's not really the point. The point is that an entire blockade and a brutal bombing campaign for 8 years wasn't enough to take these guys out of power or to slow them down. And what we think dropping a couple tomahawks is going to do it? No, it's going to do nothing except kill people. We're just unless we were actually committed. Don't get me wrong. If the U.S. military, if we wanted to invade Yemen the way we invaded Iraq, okay, we could probably overthrow the Houthis. But if we're not talking about doing that, we're just talking about murdering some people so we can feel good about ourselves. So that's kind of like now after October 7th, they did start like attacking ships, and they were like, hey, we're on behalf of these poor Palestinians, we're going to not let Israeli ships go through here, and also some American ships. And, you can feel about that however you feel about that, but I would just point out that during the ceasefire, there were no Houthi attacks. And it wasn't until the ceasefire broke down that they started doing it again. And so to me, it does kind of lead to some of these questions. I know a lot of the like pro-Israel conservative types, while they love to lecture you about moral relativism on every other front, when it comes to this, you're never allowed to say like, okay, I mean, look, it's probably not great that the Houthis are attacking ships, but at the same time, why does no one have a right to stand up for the Palestinians at all? I mean, Israel gets attacked on October 7th and they get to do this. And yet the Palestinians have to endure all of this, and no one has a right to like close down some shipping lanes or something. Again, I wouldn't say no one has a right to do it, but it's just like I guess it's just very clear. It's like, oh, so this is another cost associated with supporting Israel's slaughter of Palestinians.
And there's endless costs over and over, and that's the nature of entangling alliances. The founders knew it. Jefferson knew it. Washington knew it. John Quincy Adams famously boasted that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Well, the last century tells a different tale, and it's a far more grim tale.
So now we now also have to, right, which is like the whole story of U.S. foreign policy always. We now have to, once again, we have to take on Israel's problems and make them our own. Now, we're in this beef, which is so clearly has nothing to do with us and has to do with what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people, which is objectively horrific. But now, because we're the ones funding that and arming that and giving it diplomatic cover, we now find ourselves in yet another conflict. The last thing that this country needs. And one of the things that Donald Trump ran and won on twice was the idea that we don't need more conflicts like this. And then, of course, we're right back in another one. So,
right. Just remember, in the last few weeks of the Trump campaign, he devoted particular attention to raking the neocons over the coals, especially Liz Cheney. He got a lot of flack for that. Remember when he made that comment about how, well, if Liz Cheney was serving on the front lines, she would be thinking a lot differently than the way she talks and votes. Well, he got destroyed for that. And his rhetoric was good. He was right to attack the neocons. You know, he gets a lot of the credit for ending the Clinton and Bush dynasties in a way. So that he's acting differently now is, you know, very concerning. In Ukraine too, restoring the aid.
I guess that would be, I mean, I know it's just a bit of a rant, but I think it's kind of like, it's worth it to get that out there. But I can't overstate how horrible a decision this is by Donald Trump, and how much it's like it's like people would say for a while, they'd be like, oh, stop bitching about all his bad appointments. You know what I mean? Like, focus on the good ones or something. It's like, no, this is what happens when you surround yourself with a bunch of war hawks who are giving you bad information. Is there ever a point where we don't have to just kill innocent people to make this? Like, is there ever a point where like we've killed enough innocent people that it's like, I think they got the message? I think they realize that we're willing to do this. It's always just this like, no, we got to show toughness. We got to let them know. But again, you know, to my major point here, look, the idea, again, Yemen, which had started as the poorest country in the Middle East at the beginning of this, before going through the worst humanitarian crisis in the world for many years, they went through all of that and then still stuck up for the Palestinians when Israel started its assault on Gaza. And you think like a couple Tomahawk missiles are going to change that calculation? I mean, I don't think there's any serious person, even in DC, who believes that, like, all right, they got the message. Like, they needed to be smacked around and now they won't mess with our ships anymore. And I think I just read just earlier today that they vowed to continue or something like that. It's like, yeah, of course they did.
Well, Yemen put their country way too close to our naval vessels. Like, what do they expect? But that's the mentality of the neocons. And now Trump.
This isn't going to stop them. So what on earth is the point? Like, why would we be doing this? And again, it's like with all of these scenarios, every single war, they can never, whether we're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, whether we're talking about Libya or Syria, whether we're talking about Yemen, whether we're talking about Somalia, if you're talking about Ukraine, if you're talking about Israel's war in Gaza, nobody can ever clearly articulate why we're taking this action, what the end game is, and what our strategy is to go pursue that end game. And like where it's like a reasonable end game. Whenever they give you an answer to that, Rob, it's something like, we're going to drive Putin out of Crimea. And you're like, okay, yeah, but that can't ever happen. Or democracy is going to sweep the region. Or like it's always these goals that are just like on their face. You're like, yeah, but that's completely unachievable.
But then we're the conspiracy theorist if we put this out. If we object to their mantras in those places. Like, democracy was not going to sweep the Middle East. We are not going to enact regime change in Moscow. Like, both of those things are absurd, but then if you push back against it, you're the conspiracy theorist. Absurd.
no chance. There is a 0% chance that you will achieve that goal. That it's never just kind of like, okay, so we dropped this. Okay, so we killed whatever. I think it was 53 people we killed in this last strike. Okay, and we had to do that because why? What's the next step after this? Well, I guess the next step is that Trump threatens Iran and says that there'll be devastating consequences and that they're responsible for what the Houthis do.
And I have to say, based on what I've seen on Twitter, X, I can't really get used to calling it that yet. A lot of Trump's most zealous followers are saying that this bombing campaign is a masterful negotiation for peace. It's a masterful peace negotiation tactic because of how, he's trying to show Iran that he means business. Well, the Israel lobby wants Iran to take as many Tomahawk missiles as it can because they want regime change in Iran so bad. But it's just absurd. Just imagine the corner that you back yourself into if you bomb a country and then have to explain, well, it's for peace. It's like when Bush got out there in 2008 and said, I had to abandon free market principles to save the free market. Like, it just falls apart on its face.
Which is like, just doesn't even make any sense at all. I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand why it makes sense to the insane neoconservatives and the insane Likudniks and the insane, evangelical Christians who think that protecting, the Jews in Israel is what's going to bring Jesus Christ back, or the insane Jewish supremacists who think that everything should be run around the state of Israel. Okay, I get there because they just want to topple the government in Iran. That's why they all support it, because they just want to move closer to the regime change that they've always really wanted, which is the one in Tehran.
And we know that. We've known it a long time, but Wesley Clark famously saw that memo at the Pentagon. I think it was in 2002, and you can Google him talking about this, but he saw a list of the countries that, the administration at the time, the Bush administration, was planning to topple, and Iran was on that list. It was the last one. And things have pretty much panned out in accordance with that, and Israel's always wanted regime change there.
Okay, so that's why they support it. But short of that, if you weren't trying to get us into another catastrophic war in the Middle East, like if you didn't hate the United States of America and want to see this country's destruction, then why would it make any sense to start saying that Iran is responsible for anything the Houthis do? Then nobody really believes that the Iranians have complete puppet-like control over the Houthis and they can decide what they're going to do or what they're not going to do. I mean, imagine if you were to take that line with the United States of America ever. You were to say, okay, well, you guys, our government props up the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Ukrainians and all the governments that we fund and contribute to. If we were to say we're now responsible, when the Saudis murdered that Khashoggi, murdered that journalist guy and cut him up or whatever, that you say I hold Joe Biden responsible for that. That's not why. The only reason why you would even start thinking like that is if you were trying to bring America into a wider war, which has always been the huge risk since October 7th. And since the decision to start, backing Israel's assault on Gaza, this has always been the biggest risk. And now it's like Donald Trump is he's walking into this trap and seems to be willingly doing it. So, there certainly has been some positives of the Trump administration so far, but man, is he flirting with throwing all of that away right now. And then even just aside from, aside from the kind of potential disasters that could come out of this, just this in itself, just killing a bunch of innocent people. I mean, I know this is the United States of America and we've gotten so used to that. That's just part of what our government does.
And isn't that the saddest tale of what our government does, is that people are so desensitized to innocents dying that, it barely gets on the news a lot of the time. It's crazy.
But isn't it something that the government can just like take an action that's going to kill, including several children reportedly were killed in these strikes. And like, it's just, I don't know. It's so crazy to me that murdering children wouldn't be something that collectively as a society we go like, well, man, I mean, if you ever have to do that, then there's a serious process that we go through. And that process involves laying out the case of why you absolutely have no other choice but to do this.
Yeah, as opposed to announcing it after you unilaterally decide to bomb without congressional authority and after you campaigned on a non-interventionist platform. It's absolutely maddening.
But no, Donald Trump just decides. And then isn't it interesting? You know, Daryl Cooper had a great post about this the other day. But isn't it interesting, right, that there's no judge, there's no congressman, there's no cable news show host that will ever even dream of like making this the issue. You know, like, whoa, the president is just like committing an act of war. He doesn't have to consult anybody but like his donors or something like that. He doesn't even have to talk.
Yeah, Miriam Adelson is who he consulted before this. That's probably the only person.
Talk to anybody in Congress. He doesn't, you know, when you hear all this stuff about like Elon Musk is auditing USAID, well, this is outside, you know, this is anti-democratic. He doesn't have the authority to do that. But yet when it comes to making war, just crickets. You know, even like the Democrats who are always talking about Trump is Hitler and he's this and that and he's an authoritarian, end of democracy. No one really cares when it's just murdering kids. And there's something so profoundly sick and backward about all of that. And no matter how much it happens, that will never be normal to me. I'll never get used to that and just go like, yeah, well, I mean, you know, come on. There were little brown kids in a third world country. I mean, who cares? You know, like, yeah, I don't know. Sorry. I still think that's profoundly horrible. Just an awful thing to do. And especially when you're doing it like with no clear-cut reason as to why this absolutely had to be done. And to your point that you made before, I mean, just like, I'm sorry, there's just there are other ways to protect shipping lanes other than just constantly being in a state of slaughtering innocent people. I just don't believe otherwise. By the way, just the money we spend on the bombs, you know, we could probably just pay off people to be able to ship for less money. So it's all just terrible. And, you know, again, it's nothing that any of us should really be shocked by. I mean, this is Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump, he backed the Saudi war against the people of Yemen for every single day of his first term. So I don't think he's going to be moved over like some innocent people in Yemen got killed. I mean, he seems to be quite comfortable doing it. And,
yeah, sad to say. And one thing Dave didn't mention, and I'm sure he's mentioned it in a lot of his other shows, is that Donald Trump used one of his sole presidential vetoes to end an attempt to terminate all U.S. involvement in that theater in Yemen. And I think it was in 2019. You can check me on that in the comments if you want, but I think that was the year. He vetoed a bill that would have done that. And again, the only constituencies that are supporting this is the Saudis, involved in 9/11, that's public knowledge now, and the military-industrial complex, the bomb makers, and now Israel, because obviously they want Iran taken out. So this is just a disaster. I think Dave's right on the money here, as he so often is on these issues. If you would have asked me, you know, what could derail Trump's approval ratings, I actually said this on the Free Thought Project podcast that I went on, you know, soon after he became president. I said, I think the only things that can really derail the faith that people have in him in those first few weeks, especially, you know, when Doge got started and the dismantling of US aid and some other things, is one, an economic collapse, which very well could happen. It looks like we've seen a correction in the market this last week too, this last 2 weeks, or another war, and especially that becomes a case if it becomes a regional war, as again, the Middle East seems like it might be primed for that. And I don't want to be a doomsday soothsayer, but man, there sure are a lot of dangerous dynamics going on there right now, and the US is making it even more dangerous as far as I'm concerned. The true America First solution is to get out of there, get out of Syria too, and stop all aid to Israel. But what do you guys think? How serious do you think the Yemen issue is, and Trump's decision to bomb the Houthis? Let me know in a comment below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until we see each other next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out. I'll see you guys next time.